What's going on, everybody? In today's video, we're going to talk about Charlotte, North Carolina, first black serial killer. This man went off to kill 11 black women between 91 and 94. Let's get into the video.
Yeah. I remember as a youngster, you standing on the block out there playing hopscotch, making a lollipop. I wanted to come and talk, but I was shy back then. Baddest girl in the school, thought I had no man. Closest to friends, used to pick and laugh at me, used to call me silly names, cause I was so full and jagged. Exactly how I thought it would be. Years later, I'm in the Bahamas, sipping, lifting.
What's going on, man? It's your boy Finesse Game, the best game. If you disagree, it's because you lame. Back with another flame. What's up to everybody on the East Coast? What's up to everybody on the West Coast? Down South, Midwest, and everywhere in between, if you know what I mean. We got another video today about a man that goes by the name of Henry Louis Wallace. Henry Louis Wallace was a serial killer in the early 1990s from North Carolina. He went on a killing spree, killing 11 black women. From 91 to 94, he killed 11 black women before they finally caught up with him. So we're going to get right into the video without further ado. Make sure y'all check out this female, this chick, this sister, who has a YouTube channel called Black Girl Gone. It's nice. Check her out. I'm going to put her link in the description. This is one of her videos. So let's go and check it out, man.
9 of those women had been strangled to death inside their own homes in Charlotte, North Carolina. When the investigation into the murders began, police did not make a connection between the victims until 22 months after the murder spree began. After 4 women were murdered in March 1994, investigators were able to narrow down their suspect. And when they did, they uncovered a serial killer.
Let me stop you real quick. The reason why I like this sister, watch how she dissects it. Very, very smart sister. Watch how she dissects and break this story down, nigga. I'm talking about to the all the way down to the bare bones, so you can actually go through the whole process, man. This woman is cold. She's very good at what she do. Let's check this out, man.
When people hear the words serial killer, the names that most often come to mind are Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy. They are among the most infamous serial killers in history, and statistically, most serial killers who have been caught and identified have been white men, most of whom fit a particular profile. But not all serial killers are white men, and although not as common, black serial killers do exist. The problem is, they tend to be able to hide under the radar longer because their victims, more often than not, are black women whose murders are not thoroughly investigated. In this week's story, the families of the women that were murdered in Charlotte in the early 90s know all too well what happens when police fail to identify the pattern of a serial killer in time. They believe that had police dedicated more resources when the first women were found murdered, they may have been able to recognize the pattern earlier and possibly save some of these women's lives. Over the span of 22 months, 10 women were murdered, 9 of them strangled and raped inside their own homes, and it was the connection between them that ultimately helped solve these brutal murders. The story of those 9 victims begins in June 1992 with the disappearance of Caroline Love. At the time, Caroline, who was 20 years old, was working at a Bojangles restaurant as a cashier, where she had been employed for 2.5 years. Caroline was born and raised in Charlotte and attended Northeast Junior High School, where she ran track. After high school, Caroline attended Garinger High School, and after graduation, she enrolled at Central Piedmont Community College, where she studied nursing. In September 1989, Caroline began working at Bojangles. Her manager at the restaurant said that she was a hard worker who didn't mind filling in and picking up extra shifts. Quote, she had a good work ethic. Everybody liked her, he told the Charlotte Observer. In June 1992, Caroline was...
Before we continue, man, I want to give a shout out to all them boys and all them lovely ladies out there in North Carolina, man. Shout out to y'all. If y'all know anything about this story, sound off in the comments and let me know. If I'm getting something wrong, we just reacting to it to see what's going on. But I know that y'all that's from there actually got more in depth of what's really going on and what really went on back then. Let's get back into it.
living with a roommate, Sadie McKnight, in Darby Terrace Apartments on Central Ave. Her apartment was conveniently located because it was only 6 blocks from her job. On June 15th, 1992, Caroline worked her normal shift, and when her shift was over, she asked her manager if she could buy a roll of quarters because she needed to do her laundry. The manager said it was fine, and so Caroline gave them a $10 bill in exchange for the quarters. Shortly after midnight, Caroline left her job and began walking home. On her way to her apartment, a cousin of hers named Robert spotted her walking and offered her a ride home. Robert said that he dropped her off at her apartment and watched her while she went inside. But it was the last time anyone in Caroline's family would ever see her again. A couple days after Caroline was last seen going into her apartment, her sister Kathy got a call from one of the managers at the Bojangles. Kathy also worked at the restaurant at the time, but the manager was calling because Caroline had not shown up to work for 2 days, and they were concerned. After 2.5 years, Caroline had become known as a reliable, responsible employee, and so it was very unlike her to miss her scheduled shifts without calling. After getting the call, Kathy went over to her sister's apartment and knocked on the door, but no one answered, and so she left a note for Caroline asking for her to get in contact with her. But the next day, Kathy got another call from Bojangles informing her that Caroline still had not shown up for work. At that point, Kathy was becoming more concerned that something had happened, and so she reached out to Sadie, Caroline's roommate, to see if she had spoken to her. But Sadie had not, and she said that she too was concerned because it wasn't like Caroline to be gone that long without contacting her. After realizing that no one had seen or spoken to Caroline in days, Kathy decided it was time to go to the police and file a missing persons report. Once a report was filed, Kathy went back to her sister's apartment, and this time she was able to get inside and look around, and she immediately noticed that some of her sister's furniture had been moved around and that the sheets on the bed were missing. It seemed suspicious to her, but there was no other evidence that anything had happened inside that apartment. Now, when police began looking into Caroline's disappearance, investigators also went to her.
Hit them likes buttons, man. Let's get these likes up in here, man. Hey, I told y'all this girl bad. Now, this man has 10, 11 victims. I want to say 11. She's going to break down every victim and how they became a victim of this man. So if y'all really want to know anything about psychology or anything about, if that's your thing, trying to get inside the mind of a person and why they do things, this sister really breaks it down. She just don't give you the fluff. She actually gives you the point of view so you can understand the victim. That's how you have more of an impact.
Her apartment to look for evidence, and they too found the scene somewhat suspicious. The sheets on her bed had been removed, but they were not in the apartment, and the roll of quarters she had bought to do her laundry were not there. Aside from the things that appeared out of place, there was no physical evidence, however, inside that gave police any clues about what may have happened to Caroline. Detectives followed up on a few leads, but eventually they hit a wall, and the case went cold. Caroline continued to be missing, but Charlotte police had pretty much given up their search to find her. After Caroline went missing, Sadie moved in with her boyfriend, a man named Henry Wallace, a local fast food restaurant manager who she had been dating for about 2 years, and since she could not afford the rent at her apartment, she moved in with him. But 7 months after Caroline seemingly vanished, another family would have a similar experience, except they wouldn't have to wait long to find out their loved one's fate. In February 1993, 20-year-old Shauna Hawk was living with her mother in Charlotte, where she had been born and raised. She was the second child and only daughter of Sylvia Sumter and Walter Hawk II. People who knew her described her as sweet, shy, and gentle. She attended East Mecklenburg High School and worked part-time at McDonald's while in high school. After she graduated, like Caroline, she also attended Piedmont Community College, where she studied to become a paralegal. She also worked part-time at Taco Bell at the time. Now, Shauna and her mother had remained close as she blossomed into adulthood. Her parents had split up, and Shauna stayed with her mom while her brothers moved to Atlanta with their dad. On February 19th, 1993, Sylvia came home to the apartment that she shared with Shauna to begin dinner for that evening. Normally, Shauna would have been home before her, but when Sylvia arrived at the apartment, Shauna was not there. Sylvia thought it was strange that she wasn't home yet, but when she looked in the closet and found Shauna's coat and purse, she started to get a strange feeling. Shauna's car was not there, but the fact that she had left her coat and purse was very weird, especially considering the fact that it was cold outside. Sylvia said that her daughter would have not gone anywhere without her purse, and when she saw her earlier that day, she was wearing her coat. At the time, Shauna was dating a young man named Daryl, and so Sylvia called him to see if he had seen Shauna, but he said that he hadn't seen her or spoken to her all day. After calling Daryl, Sylvia called Taco Bell where her daughter worked to see if she had been called to fill in a shift, but when she called the restaurant, they told her that Shauna was not on the schedule that evening. Now, while trying to track down her daughter, Sylvia also learned that Shauna was supposed to pick up her godson at 3 p.m. from daycare, but she had never shown up. When Sylvia looked in Shauna's purse, she found her keys missing, along with her money, and none of it made any sense. After Daryl found out that Shauna was missing, he went over to Sylvia's to see if he could help her in finding where Shauna had gone. Once he was there, they decided that they should call the police and file a missing persons report. After police took the report, Daryl decided to take a look around the two-story apartment to see if maybe he could find any clues about where Shauna had gone. He went from room to room, eventually making his way downstairs to a bathroom where he noticed that the shower curtain was outside of the tub. When he entered the bathroom and pulled back the shower curtain, he made a horrifying discovery. Curled in the fetal position, submerged in water, was Shauna. Daryl ran upstairs and told Sylvia to call 911. When EMS arrived, they rushed Shauna to the hospital where she was officially pronounced dead. The following day, when an autopsy was performed, the medical examiner determined that Shauna had suffered blunt force trauma before her death, but the ultimate cause of her death was ligature strangulation. When detectives began investigating Shauna's murder, they immediately became suspicious of her boyfriend Daryl. Since there had been no forced entry at Shauna's home, investigators believed that she likely knew her killer and trusted them enough to let them in her home. Detectives interviewed Daryl for weeks, but ultimately were unable to find any evidence connecting him to Shauna's murder or any motive for why he would have wanted to kill her. Other friends and family members were also interviewed, but investigators could not narrow down any other suspects. Eventually, this case also became cold, and investigators placed it on the back burner. Sylvia said that detectives would not talk to her or update her about their investigation or lack thereof. While Sylvia continued to push for answers and help in finding who killed her daughter, yet another young woman and fast food worker would also be strangled to death 4 months after Shauna's brutal murder and 1 year after Caroline vanished after her shift at Bojangles. In June 1993, 24-year-old Audrey Spain was living in an apartment in Charlotte after moving there from Bayboro, where she was originally from. The youngest of 5 children, people who knew Audrey described her as a strong-willed, self-assured young woman. When she was younger,
I'll be trying not to talk as much because I know y'all want to get the story too, man. Hey, if y'all feeling this, man, give your boy a like, give me a thumbs up, and if you're really feeling it, give me a comment, man. It don't take much to give somebody a comment. It don't take much to give somebody a like. But anyway, even if you don't, man, I appreciate y'all being here. I appreciate y'all rocking with me. But without further ado, we're gonna get right back into the video, man.
She practiced karate and had perfect attendance in middle school. After high school, she attended Denmark Technical and Horry Georgetown Technical colleges.
Beautiful sister.
After Audrey graduated from Horry Georgetown Technical College, she decided to move to Charlotte to start a new chapter in her life. And she landed a job as an assistant manager at a Taco Bell near the Eastland Mall. According to her family and friends, Audrey was happy with her life in Charlotte. She had a job, an apartment, and had even bought herself a new car. Everything seemed to be going really well. But in June 1993, Audrey's family would join the growing list of Charlotte families of young Black women missing or murdered that year. On June 23, 1993, Audrey was scheduled to be at work at Taco Bell at 6:30 p.m., but when her shift started, Audrey had not shown up or called out. This behavior was unusual for her, and so her manager, Mark, decided that he would go over to her apartment and check on her. When he arrived at the building, he could see Audrey's car parked outside, and so he left and decided to call her and leave a message for her on her answering machine. The next day, June 24th, after still not hearing from Audrey, Mark again drove past her apartment, and her car was still in the same spot. He was really starting to worry about Audrey, and so he called her sister to let her know what was going on, but she didn't answer his call, and so he left a message for her. That evening, Audrey was scheduled to work, but again, she did not show up for her shift. By this time, Audrey's sister still had...
Seems that he picking up females that work at fast food places. So most of the time they clocking out of their shift, or they finna get out, or they finna get off, or something like that, man. But whoever this dude is, they got to know him. They got to know him, man. They got to know him, because it just seems too unlikely of a situation where all these young black beautiful women that got stuff going for themselves is just dropping. This dude is a predator. He's preying on these females, man. We're gonna get back into it though, man.
Not return Mark's phone call, and so he took it upon himself to call the police. After getting the call, police drove past her apartment a few times and knocked on the door, but they were never able to make contact with her. 2 days after Audrey was last seen, on June 25th, the maintenance workers at her apartment entered her apartment through the glass door. Now, it's not exactly clear if they were sent there by Mark or the police, or if this was just scheduled maintenance. But when the workers entered the apartment, they found Audrey lying on her bed, deceased. When detectives arrived to investigate the scene, they noticed that there were no signs of forced entry at the apartment. They could also tell that the killer had washed the body in an attempt to cover up any potential evidence. Once the autopsy was performed, it was determined that Audrey had been strangled to death, just as Shauna had 4 months before. But despite the similarities, investigators were not making a connection. Both women were in their 20s, both strangled, and both worked at Taco Bell. It would seem as if these coincidences would raise flags, but no one was looking into the fact that these crimes were possibly connected. There were different detectives on the cases and clearly no coordination between them. In Audrey's case, her family and friends were also interviewed, but no suspect emerged, and they couldn't find any evidence to point them in one direction or the other. But Caroline, Audrey, and Shauna were not the first victims, and they would not be the last. In fact, no one in Charlotte knew how many more victims there would be before the killer would be caught. In the early 90s, a series of brutal murders took place in Charlotte, North Carolina, over a 22-month period, and 10 women were brutally murdered. But despite the similarities in these cases, it would take the Charlotte police months before they were able to put the pieces together. After Audrey Spain's murder in June 1993, Detectives had failed to turn up any evidence that would lead to her killer. They also had been unable to find any evidence to lead them to whoever had killed Shauna just a few months before. But 1 month after Audrey's murder, another young woman would be found dead. In August 1993, 21-year-old Valencia Jumper was living in Charlotte and was a senior at Johnson C. Smith University, where she was majoring in political science. She also worked part-time at a Food Lion grocery store and a local department store. Valencia was originally from Columbia, South Carolina, where she was born and raised. After she graduated from high school at Columbia High School, she moved to Charlotte for school and moved into an apartment that she originally shared with a roommate before they moved out. Valencia's family and friends said that she was happy in Charlotte and looking forward to graduating. On August 9th, 1993, Valencia spoke to a friend of hers on the phone named Zachary, and they made plans to meet up that night. In the early morning hours of April 10th, Zachary went over to Valencia's apartment, but when he arrived, he could see smoke coming out of the window where she lived.
Smoke.
Zachary went to the door of the apartment, and he said it was unlocked, and so he tried to go inside, but the smoke was too thick, and so he ran to a neighbor and asked them to call 911. When firefighters arrived and put out the blaze, they found Valencia's body in the bedroom. The initial investigation determined that the fire had originated from the stove and was likely caused by a pot being left on. When an autopsy was performed, the body was badly burned, but the ME determined that Valencia had died from thermal burns. When her family learned of her tragic death, they thought it was uncharacteristic of her to leave the stove on and fall asleep. She was usually careful about that kind of thing, but the ME's ruling, they had no choice but to believe that this was a tragic accident.
Okay, yeah.
It would take 7 months before the truth would come out about what really happened to Valencia that night. But a month later, in September 1993,
You ain't done yet.
20-year-old Michelle Stinson
You
would
ain't
become
done
the
yet.
5th victim in this series of murders.
That's just the 5th.
At the time, Michelle was living in an apartment in Charlotte with her 2 children and was attending Central Piedmont College, where she was studying graphic design. Michelle was doing her best to maintain things while raising her boys and balancing school, but she was doing well in school and managed to maintain A's and B's in most of her classes. But on September 15th, 1993, a friend of Michelle's named James decided to stop by and visit her at the Grier Apartments where she lived with her children. When he arrived at the apartment, he knocked on the door, but no one answered. However, he could hear the children inside knocking on the window, and they were telling him that Mommy was asleep on the kitchen floor. James said that he thought that the children were just playing, but when he knocked again, Michelle did not come to the door. Figuring she was just taking a nap, James said he turned to leave, but as he did,
Imagine that some kids tell you come to check on your loved one. They're not coming to the door, and the kids knocking on the window telling you that mommy sleep on the kitchen floor. As an adult, you already know what it is. He probably kicked in the door, busted the window. You gotta come in now, man.
Michelle's oldest son opened the door and grabbed him. James picked the boy up and went into the apartment, and there, lying on the kitchen floor in a puddle of blood, was Michelle Stinson. James picked up the phone to call 911, but he noticed that the cord had been cut, and so he took the children to a neighbor's where they called 911 and waited for the police. Once police arrived, they found a gruesome scene. Michelle had a towel wrapped around her neck, and she had been stabbed. But again, there were no signs of forced entry at this apartment. There had now been 3 victims that year that had been found strangled to death inside their own apartments with no forced entry. 2 victims worked at Taco Bell, and all 3 victims, at some point, had been students at Central Piedmont College. This murder, however, did differ from the other 2 because Michelle had been stabbed. Now, despite the fact that there seemed to be a pattern emerging with young Black women being brutally murdered, police were still not seeing it. As news of these murders began to spread throughout the community, people were afraid. Someone was out there murdering young women and no one had been caught. And more importantly, it felt like no one was really doing anything to find the killer. Sadly, there were more victims to come. In February 1994, Vanessa Mack would be the first victim of that year. After Michelle Stinson's murder in the fall of 1993, there were no more murders or disappearances that year. Charlotte police, however, were feeling the heat as the community was asking more and more questions. But before they could answer any of them, Vanessa Mack would join the list of victims. In February 1994, Vanessa Mack was 25 years old and living in Charlotte with her 2 young daughters. At the time, she was working at Carolina Medical Center. According to reports, friends of Vanessa said that she had a rough childhood, but she was doing her best to be a good mom to her 2 children. On February 20th, 1994, the grandmother of her oldest daughter, Barbara, came over to Vanessa's apartment because she was supposed to pick up the children as she did every Sunday so that Vanessa could go to work. Barbara arrived at the apartment at around 6 a.m. and went to the back door and noticed that it was open. Barbara went inside and she called out to Vanessa, but didn't get a response. Vanessa's 4-month-old daughter was lying on the couch alone, which Barbara knew was strange. And so she went back to where Vanessa's bedroom was. And when she opened the door, she could see Vanessa's feet hanging over the bed. She was dead. Barbara took the children out of the apartment and went to a neighbor's to call 911. When detectives arrived, they found Vanessa with a towel around her neck, just like Michelle Stinson. There was blood coming from her nose and the back of her head. Her purse had also been emptied out, and the contents were scattered on the bed. And like the 3 other strangulation murder victims found in Charlotte over that past year, there were no signs of forced entry at the apartment. And also,
if you notice something, with each one of these victims, there are no signs of forced entry. That means the person either had to be known to them or had to be real close to them, because most people is not going to let somebody know anybody in their house. So keep that in the front of your mind as we going through these victims. I want y'all to pay attention. Hit them likes, hit that bell notification so y'all can be notified whenever I drop some more of these reaction videos. Black Girl Gone podcast. I'm reacting to it. We back up in here. Let's keep that clip rolling.
Autopsy later determined that Vanessa had died from ligature strangulation. 1 woman missing, 4 had been strangled in their own homes with no sign of forced entry, and 1 dies in a mysterious fire. 6 women were all gone, and no one was being held accountable. But Vanessa's murder was not going to be the last. As the murders piled up in the community, they were becoming more and more angry with police about how these cases were being handled. Sylvia, Shauna's mother, was very vocal about her frustrations. Black people in Charlotte began to feel like no one cared about these women because they were Black.
They don't.
They believed that if these murders had been taking place in a different area, police would be handling things a whole lot differently. In the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, in the early 90s, a serial killer was preying on young Black women, and the community was terrified and angry. As the murders piled up, there seemed to be no movement in the investigations of these crimes, and people were convinced that the Charlotte PD felt like these women were disposable. And just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, 3 more women were brutally murdered. Brandy Henderson was 18 years old in March 1994 and was living in Charlotte, North Carolina, with her boyfriend and 10-month-old son. Life for Brandy had not always been easy. Her parents separated when she was 2, and she moved a lot and spent more time with her father than her mother. But everyone who knew Brandy said that she was a sweet girl who was always happy and wanted other people to be happy too. As a young teen, she attended Gloryland Baptist Church, where she would attend children's church. The gentleman who ran the children's church said that Brandy was one of the sweetest kids he ever had in his program. As a teen, Brandy ended up having to drop out of high school, but eventually, she went back to get her diploma from Harding High. In May 1993, when Brandy was 17, she gave birth to a little boy she named Therese. Eventually, Brandy and her boyfriend of 2 years, Verness, moved into an apartment in the Lake Apartments in Charlotte. On March 9th, 1994, Brandy had a doctor's appointment scheduled, and so she left her son with his father at home in their apartment and went to her appointment. Later that afternoon, she arrived back at their home. Verness was scheduled to work that evening, and so around 5 p.m., he left Brandy and their son alone in the apartment. Since Verness worked 2 jobs, it wasn't unusual for Brandy and her son to be home alone, and she always made sure that she kept the front door locked. That evening, while she was home, Brandy was on the phone with a cousin of hers. They were having a normal conversation when suddenly someone knocked on Brandy's door. Her cousin on the phone could hear Brandy and a male voice. Her cousin said that he didn't recognize the man, but he didn't think much of it because it appeared to be someone that she knew and was comfortable letting into her house.
Exactly.
He heard Brandy tell the man to lock the door behind him. But little did her cousin know,
That was the killer.
he would be the last person to ever speak to Brandy again. A few hours later, Verness returned back to their apartment after his shift ended. When he got to his front door, he immediately knew something was wrong because the door was unlocked. When he entered the apartment, it was a mess. There were items scattered throughout, and his stereo was gone. Verness walked to the bedroom, and when he entered and turned on the light, he saw his son sitting on the bed, gasping for air. He had a pair of shorts tied tightly around his neck. Verness quickly untied the shorts from around his son's neck.
Man, this fool tried to kill the baby, man. Come on, man. They gotta catch this nigga, man. This nigga done put something around the baby's neck. Yeah, he's a dirtbag of all types, man. He's the worst kind of all black people, man. Whatever happened to him, he fucking deserved it, man. We're gonna get right back into it though.
And that's when he realized that Brandy was lying face down on the bed next to their son. She wasn't breathing. When he turned her over, she had towels tied around her neck, and her face was blue. Verness untied the towels from around Brandy's neck and then called 911. The 911 operator instructed him to administer CPR, and so he moved Brandy to the floor and began trying to perform CPR on her lifeless body. But when police arrived on the scene, it was obvious to them that Brandy was dead. Therese was rushed to the hospital. He had suffered multiple injuries as a result of the ligature strangulation, but he did miraculously survive. The attack on Brandy and her son was brutal, and it was a heinous crime. The fact that the killer had also tried to strangle a 10-month-old baby meant that this murder was different than the other strangulations that had taken place. There had been other women murdered while their children were there, children older who could be witnesses, and yet they were not attacked. It was an unbelievable turn of events, but now there had been another woman murdered in her apartment, and police seemed to be no closer to finding the killer. On March 10th, the medical examiner performed an autopsy on Brandy. She had blunt force trauma and lacerations on her body, and he concluded that she had died of ligature strangulation. Brandy's murder was a devastating loss for her family and friends who could not imagine who would want to kill her. At the crime scene, it was clear that a robbery had taken place. Money was missing from Brandy's wallet, and a Pringles can that she kept coins in had been emptied out. Police had enough to conclude that this was some kind of robbery, but what they didn't know was that the last person Brandy let in her home was someone she knew and obviously trusted.
Right.
Before the investigation could really take place into who killed Brandy, another woman in the same apartment complex would also be murdered. Betty Jean Balcom, known by her family and friends as Susie, was originally from Laurel Hill, North Carolina. She graduated from Scotland High School in 1989 and began taking classes at Richmond Community College. She moved to Charlotte in September 1993 so she could find work and save money for school. She began working as an assistant manager at Bojangles on Central Avenue. Her manager said that the first time he met Betty, he knew that she was the kind of woman he wanted to be a manager at his store. Quote, she had a lot of
Them Bojangles and them Taco Bells. Man, back then in North Carolina, I wouldn't even be trying to, because it seemed like he targeting Bojangles and Taco Bells. That's his thing, man. Like, I wouldn't even, man. Rest in peace to this sister also, man.
good qualities. She was a very nice young lady, hard worker, dependable. She had a beautiful smile, her manager said to the Charlotte Observer. Betty also had a 3-year-old daughter she adopted from a family member, and she wanted to have a good job so that she could also provide for her. Within a month of being hired, Betty went from a manager trainee to a co-manager. She moved into her own apartment in the Lake Apartments, and she also had a fiance who lived in a different city outside Charlotte. And by all accounts, Betty was living a quiet, happy life in Charlotte. On March 9th, 1994, the same day that Brandy was found murdered inside her apartment, Betty was scheduled to work her shift at Bojangles, but she did not show up.
Same
The
apartment.
manager at the restaurant knew something was wrong because Betty never missed work, and so he attempted to call her several times, but he got no answer.
Apartment complex.
After being unable to get her on the phone, he began asking Betty's coworkers if they had spoken to her, but they hadn't. He then reached out to Betty's mom to ask her if she had spoken to her daughter, but she hadn't spoken to Betty either. On March 10th, the following day, Betty again did not show up for her scheduled shift. No one in Betty's family had spoken to her, and worry was beginning to set in for the people she worked with at Bojangles. Her manager and another employee decided that they would drive over to Betty's apartment to check on her. When they got there, they knocked on the door, but there was no answer. From the outside, everything appeared normal, but it was anything but. Her manager again called Betty's mom to let her know that she was not answering the door. And so together, they decided that it was time to call the police and report Betty missing. At around 10 a.m. on March 10th, a detective received the report about the missing woman living at the Lake Apartments. By that time, everyone in the area had heard about Brandy being murdered in the same complex, and so he decided to go over to the apartment building and do a welfare check. When he arrived at the apartment, he contacted maintenance and asked them to let him into Betty's apartment. When the detective entered the apartment, he made his way to the bedroom, and there he found Betty, dead, lying face down on the bed with a towel around her neck. Just like the other victims, the medical examiner concluded that Betty, too, had died from ligature strangulation. After Brandy Henderson was found strangled to death, investigators were finally starting to realize that there may be a connection between these murders. The outcry from victims' families and members of the community forced the Charlotte PD to actually begin to look into all of these murders. It's important to understand that no one is disposable. Everyone's life matters, regardless of the lifestyle you live. But these women did not live high-risk lifestyles. They weren't sex workers or drug addicts. They were mothers and students. They had jobs and lived normal lives. They were not the type of women that would be particularly vulnerable to being a victim of this kind of violence. And the people who knew them and loved them wanted them treated as such. On March 10th, before Betty was found dead in her
Good women.
apartment, investigators working on these cases had a meeting to discuss the similarity in these murders over the past several months. They also began asking family and friends of the victims for the names of people that they would have felt comfortable letting into their apartments. While investigators were piecing together that information and comparing notes from the various murders, they learned about Betty Balcom. The murder of two women in similar ways in 2 days in the same apartment complex was a wake-up call for Charlotte PD. They finally realized that they were dealing with a serial killer. Now, it was time to find the murderer and put him behind bars. When Betty was found, the car she owned was missing from the parking lot. Investigators believed that the car had been taken by the killer, and so they needed to find the car. On March 11th, police located Betty's car, and it was dusted for fingerprints. There were several prints in the car, and when police ran those prints, one of them came back as a positive match to a man named Henry Louis Wallace. And they discovered that he had an outstanding warrant for grand larceny. When the prints came back matching Henry Wallace, investigators were already familiar with that name. When the family and friends of the victims were asked to give investigators the names of people the women would have felt comfortable letting into their home, the one name they all had on their list was Henry Wallace. His prints being found in the car meant that Wallace was quickly becoming their prime suspect, and they began their search to find him. But who was Henry Louis Wallace, and how was he connected to all of these victims? As the missing pieces of this mystery started to come together, the truth about Henry Louis Wallace would shock everyone involved. After the murder of several women had gone unsolved for months, investigators in Charlotte were finally beginning to realize that there was a serial killer on the loose. After narrowing in on a suspect, detectives now needed to find him. When Brandy Henderson and Betty Balcom were found murdered in the same apartment complex, investigators hoped that the murders would stop, especially since they had identified a suspect. But while police began their search for him, yet another woman would be murdered in her apartment.
Another one.
Deborah Ann Slaughter was 35 in March 1994 and living in Charlotte, where she had a job working in a local deli. Deborah at the time had an 18-year-old son who was living out of state. The year before, Deborah had moved into the Glen Hollow apartment with her parents, but they eventually moved out, leaving Deborah the apartment. Her family and friends said that Deborah was a loving, funny woman who had a beautiful singing voice. On March 12, 1994, Deborah's mother, Lovey, went over to her apartment to return some pictures that she had borrowed from her. When she got to her daughter's apartment, she knocked on the door, but Deborah didn't answer the door, and so she assumed that her daughter was at work. Since she had a key to the apartment, she decided to just let herself in. But when she put the key in the door, she realized that it wasn't locked. Deborah's mom opened the door, and when she looked into the apartment, she could see her daughter lying on the floor. Her mom said that at first she wasn't alarmed because Deborah had been suffering back and neck pain and was actually scheduled to see a chiropractor that day. And so she thought she was lying on the floor to stretch. But when she called her name, she got no response. And as she got closer, she realized that Deborah wasn't moving, and she had a towel wrapped around her neck and a white cloth in her mouth.
Same.
Deborah was dead. Lovey called 911, and when detectives arrived, they found an all too familiar scene. Deborah was lying on the floor, face up, with the towel around her neck and cloth in her mouth, but she also had puncture wounds in her chest. When an autopsy was performed, the medical examiner determined that Deborah had been strangled and then stabbed 38 times. It was a clear escalation in the killer's pattern. There had now been 3 women, all murdered within days of each other, who died in the same way. When investigators learned of Deborah's murder, they had already begun their search for their suspect, Henry Louis Wallace. They did not have any evidence to arrest him for murder, but the outstanding warrant that he had meant they could arrest him and hold him while they found the evidence they needed to charge him. They began their search by staking out his house and discovered that he had been staying with a friend. On March 13th, 1994, at around 5:30 p.m., detectives went to the apartment where his friend lived, and inside the bathroom, hiding, they found Wallace. He was arrested on the outstanding warrant, and police brought him into the station so that he could be questioned about the murders. When detectives sat Wallace down, they began by establishing a level of trust so that he would feel more comfortable and hopefully tell them what happened. The interview began around 7 p.m. with detectives talking to...
Now look at this. Now look at him. He don't look like he'll hurt a fly. Real friendly looking. The rest, that's the reason they couldn't find him, because they was overlooking him. He don't even look like he would be a suspect. He look like he's just a friendly black dude that everybody likes. He's real cool, doesn't give anybody no problems, won't fight. But he got 10 murders on him. I digress.
Wallace about sports, his job, and his family. But after making small talk, detectives read Wallace his Miranda rights and began confronting him with the evidence they had connecting him to the murders. They asked him about the fingerprint on Betty's car. They also had obtained footage from an ATM where a man who looked like Wallace was seen using Vanessa Mack's debit card. Initially, Wallace denied killing any of the women, but after detectives started pressing him harder, Wallace cracked and began telling them what he had done. As part of their strategy, detectives asked Wallace to write down the names of the victims he killed. At that point, detectives had only made a connection between 4 of the murders, the most recent one beginning with Vanessa Mack. But as Wallace began writing, detectives realized that he was responsible for more murders than they knew. The first murder he confessed to was the murder of a woman named Sharon Nance. Wallace, however, didn't know Sharon. He didn't even know her name, and instead had wrote a question mark. Sharon was a 32-year-old woman living in Charlotte when she was murdered. According to her family, Sharon had struggled with drug addiction, which resulted in her being arrested numerous times. Her life had been difficult. She was raised by her grandfather and dropped out of school when she was 15. But despite the trouble she often found herself in, her family said that she was a sweet woman who loved drawing and writing poetry. She also had a son who she loved dearly. But in May 1992, Sharon left her aunt's house to meet friends and was never seen again. On May 27th, 1992, her body was found discarded near railroad tracks. She had been beaten to death. Her murder went mostly unnoticed. Because of her history, there was no urgency to find the person who killed her. But now, almost 2 years later, Henry Wallace was confessing to her murder. His next confession was the murder of Caroline Love, who, up until that point, was still being considered a missing person. Detectives had no idea that Caroline was dead and that Wallace had killed her too. If you recall, at the time of Caroline's disappearance, she was living with a roommate, Sadie, and Sadie's boyfriend at the time was Henry Louis Wallace. On the night that Caroline was last seen, Wallace told police that he had made a copy of his girlfriend's keys. And so that night, while both women were not home, he used the key to enter the apartment. He said when he heard Caroline come home, he told her that he was in the bathroom and was getting ready to leave. But when he came out of the bathroom, he approached Caroline, who was in the living room watching TV, and kissed her on her neck. He said that Caroline told him that if he didn't do it again, she wouldn't tell his girlfriend. But instead of leaving, Wallace put Caroline in a chokehold until she passed out. He then raped her and strangled her to death. After Caroline was dead, he wrapped her in bed sheets and then put her in a trash bag. He said he also took some of her clothes to make it appear as if she had just left. He then drove the body to a wooded area where he dumped it. The next day, he said he went back because he was afraid that someone would see the body so close to the road, and so he moved it to a ravine. He next confessed to the murder of Shauna Hawk. At the time of her murder, Shauna had been working at Taco Bell where Wallace was a manager. He said he went to Shauna's apartment and asked her if they could talk. She invited him in, but once inside, he raped Shauna. He then forced her to redress and then took her to the bathroom where he placed her in a chokehold until she passed out. He then filled the tub with water and put Shauna in it. Before he left, he stole $50 from her. In Audrey Spain's murder, Wallace had also met her while working at Taco Bell. He said that he had went over to her house with the intent to rob her. He said once he was there, the two smoked together, and then he placed Audrey in a chokehold and demanded that she give him the code to the safe at her job. When she told him that she didn't know the code, he asked her about the money that she had in her bank accounts. He then placed her in a chokehold and then raped her. Afterwards, he took her to the shower so that he could wash off evidence, and then he put her on the bed and tied a shirt and bra around her neck.
Didn't I tell y'all she was bad, man? Black Girl Gone podcast, and she does a whole bunch of these videos. She is very thorough and very in-depth. So if a lot of y'all weak-hearted, if y'all got to the video, if y'all got this far to the video, y'all still on it, I know y'all my people. But if a lot of y'all weak-hearted, don't come to my channel because I give it to you raw, plain, and uncut. Without further ado, we're going to get back into it.
He then stole her debit card and keys. He used the card to get gas. After that, he came back to the apartment to make a phone call to make it look like she had died on a different day to throw off the investigation. The next confession was the murder of Valencia Jumper, who investigators believe had died in a fire. Wallace told them that Valencia was like a little sister to him and that they had spent a lot of time together. On the night she was murdered, he had gone to Valencia's house to talk to her for a while, and then he left. He said he came back a few hours later and told Valencia that he had gotten into a fight with Sadie, his girlfriend, who he had been living with. He asked her if she would call her for him, but when Valencia went to reach for the phone, he placed her in a chokehold. He then raped her and strangled her. After Valencia was dead, Wallace wiped down her apartment to get rid of fingerprints. He said he noticed a bottle of rum, and so he took the bottle to the bedroom and poured the rum on Valencia's body and on the bed and on the floor nearby. He then went into the kitchen, opened a can of beans, put the beans in a pot on the stove, and turned the stove on. After that, he took the battery out of the smoke detector, went back to the bedroom, lit a match, and threw it on Valencia's body. He then left. Later, he returned to the apartment, and when he saw the smoke coming out of the door, he just left and went home. Wallace admitted taking jewelry from Valencia's body and pawning it in a local shop. Detectives had no idea that Valencia was murdered. Her death had been ruled accidental. But now, 7 months after her death, the truth had finally surfaced. As you can imagine, when her family found out that she was murdered, they were shocked. Wallace also confessed to the murder of Michelle Stinson and Vanessa Mack. Michelle, he had known from his time as a Taco Bell manager, and Vanessa, he had met through her sister, who he had befriended. He confessed that he had gone to both women's apartments to rob and murder them. He said he murdered Michelle while her children slept in the next room. In Vanessa's murder, Wallace said that he murdered her and stayed in the apartment until her baby fell asleep. He then took her ATM card and left. The day that Betty and Brandy were murdered, Wallace said that he went to the Lake Apartments with the intent to kill Brandy. He had become friends with her boyfriend Verness after they worked together, and so he went to Brandy and Verness's apartment expecting her to be home alone, but he had to change his plans when he realized that Verness was there. He came to the apartment and talked to him for a while. He said that he had stopped by to say goodbye because he was leaving town. But After he left, he instead went to Betty's apartment and murdered her. Betty was a friend of Sadie's, Wallace's girlfriend, who she worked with at Bojangles. After he killed her, he went back to Brandy's apartment and raped and murdered her. He said he tied the shorts around the baby's neck because he would not stop crying. After 10 hours of interviews, Henry Louis Wallace confessed to the murders of 10 women. He had known all except one. Wallace was the scariest kind of serial killer because he wasn't some creepy stranger lurking in the shadows, stalking his victims. He had known these women. They trusted him in some way. When Caroline went missing, he had gone to the police station with her sister and his girlfriend to file the report. And after Shauna's murder, he attended her funeral and offered his condolences to her mother and family.
Boy.
After Wallace's arrest was announced, there was a collective sigh of relief in the community, but there were still so many unanswered questions, like why did it take police so long to find the killer? Charlotte PD apologized to the city and the families of the victims, but they claimed that Wallace's murders varied enough that it threw them off until the last 3 victims were murdered. The apology, however, was little consolation for the families of the murdered women.
Right.
During his confession, he admitted to the murder of one more victim who had been murdered 2 years before Sharon. Her name was Tashonda Bates, and she was the first victim. Henry murdered Tashonda in his hometown of Barnwell, South Carolina. She was just 18 years old. He had been questioned in her murder, but was ultimately released as a suspect. 4 years later, they could finally solve the cold case. 2 years after his arrest, Henry Louis Wallace went on trial in September 1996. His defense tried to argue that Wallace suffered from mental illness and was a crack addict. And although there was no denying he had killed these women, the defense tried to make a case that this was not first-degree murder because the crimes were not premeditated. However, Wallace's recorded confession contradicted that. He admitted that at least in some of these cases, he went to these women's homes with the intent to rob and murder them. The trial lasted 3 months, and on January 7th, 1996, Henry Louis Wallace was convicted of the first-degree murder of 9 of the women and was given 9 death sentences. Over the next decade, Wallace attempted to overturn his death sentences, but his final appeal was rejected in 2005. As of the recording of this episode, Wallace is still on death row, awaiting execution. 30 years after Henry Louis Wallace was arrested for these brutal murders, the scars he left remained for the people who knew and loved these women. In the decades since, many of them have dedicated their lives to making sure that these women are not forgotten. Shauna Hawk's mother started a nonprofit in the wake of her murder to support the mothers of other murdered children. Henry Louis Wallace used his charming demeanor to befriend these women that he had met in various ways, and then he went into their homes and murdered them. That is not mental illness. That is evil. Right. He knew what he was doing. He knew that he would not be considered a suspect right away. He stayed close to the victims' families and put on a performance, knowing that he had murdered them. Telling the stories about what happened all those years ago is a reminder of how easy it is for the murders of Black women and girls to go unsolved. In this case, justice was served, but the murders still haunt the city of Charlotte. And for the families of these victims, there will never be justice because nothing can bring back their loved ones. May Tashonda Bethea, Sharon Nance, Caroline Love, Shauna Hawk, Audrey Spain, Valencia Jumper, Michelle Stinson, Vanessa Mack, Brandy Henderson, Betty Balcom, and Deborah Ann Slaughter rest in peace. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Don't forget to follow us on.
Appreciate y'all for rocking with me. Like I say, man, the name of that podcast or the name of that YouTube channel is Black Girl Gone. I'm gonna leave the link in the description so y'all can go over there and check her out, support her. You know, support black-owned businesses, man. You know, we all we got. But anyways, like I say, appreciate y'all. If y'all ain't hit that bell notification by now, hit that bell notification, man, so y'all can be notified when I drop some more of these reaction videos. Give me a like, give me a thumbs up. We up out of here, man. Love y'all. Peace.